The topic of today's video will be situations in RPGs where you have a lot of people in the party. I'm going to mainly focus on old school D&D because in old school D&D I feel that it was very common to have a big party. And by a big party I mean in part situations where you have a ton of players, but also a situation where your player characters aren't the only characters in the party. Another name for this would be mercenaries, retainers, hirelings, whatever. Basically characters, non-player characters that the players hire to assist them in their adventures. Now, recently I've been reading a lot of old school D&D and playing a lot of old school D&D. And by that I mean basic D&D, like the Moldvay and Mentzer versions of D&D, and as well as the original D&D from 1974 and the Greyhawk supplement. This video isn't gonna be mainly about why I like these games. There are a ton of videos and podcasts and material on the internet on these games. And what I'm talking about can also be it can also be applied to different games. But anyway, in the Moldvay edition of Basic D&D, Moldvay writes, "The best size of an adventure party is 6 to 8 characters, enough to handle the challenges which will be faced." And that to me seems like a lot of people. Like in the games I play and I have played, you're often 3 or 4 players and a GM. And in my experience, numbers similar to that are common. Like when I've seen other people play, or when I've seen people play games online and on YouTube, it seems rare to have 8 players. In the old school, very popular and indeed very good module, The Keep on the Borderlands, that module recommends having 6 to 10 players. A reason for that is, in that particular module, is that there are a lot of monsters in it. Like if you play it as written, you run up against large numbers of enemies. So you need to be a lot of people in order to challenge them and have any sort of fair chance to win. So yeah, often, like I said, groups aren't that big, and something that I've seen a lot in old school games is situations where every player has multiple characters. Like for example, Moldway also writes, and I quote, "If a dungeon is very difficult, the DM should let the players have more than one character apiece." So that's one way of having a larger group. But another way to add more numbers to the party is having retainers. And I'm mainly going to use the term retainers, but as I said, you can say hirelings, mercenaries, whatever. This is something that was common in early old school D&D games, was having retainers. And in my experience, the concept of the PCs hiring a lot of people to go along with them doesn't really exist in modern D&D to the same degree, because you can see a lot of this in the early D&D products that were created. Like for example, there were a bunch of miniatures released for an early version of D&D that featured people carrying treasure chests and people carrying torches, and 2 guys carrying like a treasure chest, and there was also a potion tester, and this guy was deemed important enough to get his own miniature, which I find pretty amusing because it doesn't seem to be something that happens too much in modern contemporary D&D. A excellent blogger named James Malisevsky on his blog Grognardia wrote this about the phenomenon of hirelings in old school D&D. Old school D&D was not a game in which a small band of hyper-competent heroes braved the dangers of the world with only their swords, spells, and wits to protect them. No, they had a veritable army of hirelings and henchmen to assist them, and these guys got a share of the loot in exchange for their assistance. I have to agree with the writer here that in a lot of these old materials, they seem to encourage having mercenaries. And a lot of people who write about old school D&D also write about this, the fact that the players should bring along with them retainers if they want to survive. And something that makes retainers very valuable in old school D&D is the fact that old school D&D was more lethal than contemporary D&D. That is, I've played both modern versions of D&D and the old school ones, and I feel that it's definitely easier to die in old school D&D. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it adds to the fun of the game when it's easy to die and you have to really try hard to succeed, and there are real stakes involved. But in order to make the chances of winning greater, then it's only logical that the player characters would bring along other guys with them. However, this conception that a lot of old school D&D fans have, it might not be a correct one. Because a lot of the writers of basic D&D products, such as Moldway, wrote things that seem to indicate that you shouldn't rely too much on henchmen. For example, I quote from Moldway here. It is recommended that the DM not allow beginner characters to hire retainers. New players tend to use retainers as a crutch, letting them take all the risks. If a dungeon is very difficult, the DM should let the players have more than one character apiece before using retainers. This certainly came as a surprise to me, because I, as a lot of other people, I was under the impression that these games seem to encourage the players to bring mercenaries along with them, but apparently not. Moldway seems to think that retainers should be used mainly for higher level characters. And this thing brings me to another interesting part of the rules of old school D&D. Hirelings didn't go in the dungeon with the players, and this seems important because while old school D&D isn't solely a game about going in dungeons, it certainly is a large part of the game. I quote, "Mercenaries, like specialists, they will usually not go on dungeon adventures and will only participate in wilderness adventures, such as fighting other armies, clearing land of monsters around the castle, and defending the castle." I find it cute that the castle is implied, like they say the castle like it's like, of course you have a castle and you need to defend it. I find that charming. This quote mentions specialists, and specialists in this sense means people you hire who aren't hired muscle, more like an alchemist or a guide or like the potion tester I mentioned earlier. But yeah, anyways, the specialists, like the mercenaries, the hired soldiers, they won't go into the dungeon, or they usually won't go in the dungeon, I should say. In the light of these things, mercenaries don't seem to, like the authors of early D&D didn't seem to think that mercenaries should play a big role in the game, because otherwise I believe they would have let them go in the dungeon, or intend for them to go in the dungeon. Okay, so thus far I've been talking about what is written about hirelings and big parties with a lot of people in them in the original D&D sources. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of my own experience in actually playing in a old school D&D game that features a very large group, a very large party, consisting of a number of player characters, and the players have one character apiece, and they also have along with them a large number of mercenaries. In this game we're playing through the aforementioned old school D&D module Keep on the Borderlands. And as I said, the Keep on the Borderlands is for 6 to 10 players, or 6 to 10 player characters rather. From the beginning I felt that the concept of every player having a number of player characters, it seemed off to me. It seemed like it would be a weird way to play role-playing games, so I decided against it. However, in this module, and this isn't too much of a spoiler, but you can hire mercenary soldiers in the tavern. So my players, they knew that old school D&D is a hardcore game, it's easy to die. So they quickly began hiring a lot of mercenaries in the game. And for their in their early forays into the wilderness outside the town, they went alone or they went with 2 mercenary soldiers. And then the game was very much like other role-playing game campaigns I played earlier. But it quickly changed because as the party got more money, as the players got more money, they started hiring more and more soldiers. And the feel of the game rapidly changed, and it changed in kind of a cool way, where after a while it wasn't like an adventuring group, it was more like the players were the leaders of a small army unit or a small expedition. Because, not to spoil anything about the Keep on the Borderlands, but the game, that module is kind of about having a base of operations in a town and going out into sort of wild, unexplored country and encountering different things there. It's centered a lot on exploration, as are many sandbox modules. So the party started out as a little group of adventurers, but they rapidly became like the leaders of an expeditionary force of men, where they not only had hired soldiers, they also had a hired guide, basically a hired hunter, and a couple of donkeys to carry all their stuff, because I believe it was Napoleon said that an army marches on its stomach, and the mercenaries, they needed food, and someone needed to carry all that food, and hence the donkeys. So this was pretty cool, and this goes very much in line with the quote from Grognardia, where James says, or writes rather, they had an army of hirelings and henchmen to assist them, and so on. In a sense, this was pretty cool. And also, in this game, I allowed the mercenaries and the animals, the pack animals, to join the player characters as they go into a dungeon that exists in this module. And the reason for this is, again, a little bit of a spoiler, but there are large numbers of monsters in this dungeon. And when I say monsters, I mean humanoid enemies such as orcs, goblins, and so on. And as I said, there are large numbers of them, and my group in this game are 3 player characters, and if they went up 3 guys against like 20 orcs, and that's just one room, they would quickly be no more. So as I said, in a way, having the player characters be the bosses of a large number of retainers was cool. Like, one of my players said that it gives a very corporate feeling the party plans like, okay, we have this much gold, we can pay the mercenaries, we can keep them around for this many days, and what if 3 of them die? Then we can keep them. We can keep them for a longer time because we don't have to pay the ones that die, right? It's very like a very callous way to view their hired help, but it's fun to see them get enthusiastic about their economic planning. The problems with having a large party also pertains to what I just mentioned, namely economic planning. Because having a lot of guys means having a lot of administration of those guys. Because you have to keep track of how much money you owe them, and you need to keep track of how many hit points they all have in combat. I believe that the group, they have like something like 8 or 10 mercenaries. It's been a while since I played in that game, but once you get into a combat, for one thing, there are a lot, like I said, you have to keep track of all their hit points, you have to keep track of who's standing where, and who loses hit points. And also in combat, I've kind of gotten the feeling that every character, even the player characters, feels less important when there are a lot of them. Because the way my players have worked this out in combat is that every player is assigned, I think, something like 3 or 4 mercs, and it's his task to decide what those mercenaries are gonna do during any given combat round. So instead of having just his player character to keep track of, he now has 4 or 5 characters to keep track of. And I've gotten the feeling that every character, like even the player characters, they're just another man in the fight, of which there are many. So that's kind of I feel that's a huge minus in any role-playing game, to have your character feel like less important, like just another guy in the troop, because that's what the group has become. Like they're not an adventuring party anymore, they're like a military formation, and in a way that's cool, but in a way it kind of steals some individuality from the player characters. Now, what would I recommend you doing based on these experiences? Well, the game I've played and the sources I have cited are all old school D&D, but I feel that these lessons can be applied to any game really, where you are thinking about having a lot of hired help for the characters, or having a lot of player characters. Like every player has 3 guys under his that he role plays. Basically, in short, I would recommend against it. In a lot of the old school modules, like I said, I would instead scale back the number of enemies that are encountered, or maybe scale back the number of hit points that certain enemies have. Because, like, I don't subscribe to the theory that role-playing games should be like telling stories, but you can also not deny that D&D as a game, and indeed all role-playing games as sort of successors to D&D, because in a way they are, the D&D being the first, like one of the first anyway, real role-playing games. These games are based, or they are inspired by written stories. Let's say The Lord of the Rings, okay, they're a big group, but it's not like they have a bunch of hired help with them. Like, I feel a lot of fantasy stories aren't stories about the leaders of a small military company. They are stories about like a small band of adventurers or a solitary adventurer doing things, and the story is sort of about him as a character, or they as characters, overcoming great odds. Not like using their hired help to overcome great odds. Like, I'm a big fan of the Conan stories, and Gary Gygax, one of the creators of D&D, was too. And I feel that D&D in many ways is more... D&D is more Conan than it is The Lord of the Rings, if that makes sense. And even if Conan, in many of the stories, he commands men in battle, a lot of the Conan stories aren't about him and some other guys, it's about him going on adventures, and he himself overcoming great challenges. So yeah, if in the future I'm going to have games with a lot of mercenaries, I'm basically gonna try to remove and lessen all counting, all administration that needs to be done with the mercenaries, because I cannot overstate how big of a problem that is. Like, basically, in my game with all the mercs in Keep on the Borderlands, one of the players initially said like, okay, I take it upon myself to keep track of all the pay for the mercenaries and their hit points, and it damn well near burned him out. Like, you could really see that he was getting frustrated with all the calculation he needed to do, and all the mental force he needed to expend to just to keep all that stuff in memory and keep it organized like on a messy piece of paper. And some of my players even entertained the idea to make some sort of Excel spreadsheet with functions to keep track of the payment and the food and the hit points of the mercenaries. And that, to me, it doesn't seem fun. Like, D&D shouldn't be like it shouldn't be like keeping track of the economy of your private business. It should be about adventure. So yeah, I feel like if you could in some way make some rules modifications as to where you don't have to keep track of the hit points of the mercenaries, and you don't have to like count the money day by day that you owe the mercenaries. Like, for example, I've been entertaining the idea to have it where the mercenaries don't have hit points. Like, if they take a certain amount of damage in one hit, they're just dead, and all damage below that amount, it doesn't stick around, like it doesn't add up. Like, say for example, one mercenary takes a single point of damage in a round, it's not, you don't keep track of it, but if he gets a significant wound, then he's just dead. That would eliminate the need to keep track of individual hit points on each mercenary. And also I thought about having the payment for the mercenaries be like a single sum of money that you give up front or after a task. Like, let's say for example, you hire 3 mercenaries and you go out in the wilderness, and then in advance the player characters, they strike a bargain with these mercs, and they say, okay, we're gonna go out, and when we come back we will pay you each 100 gold, just for example. And then you don't keep track of how many days you've been out, and you don't have to keep track of anything else. You just have to remember, when we return, 300 golds for the mercenaries. Essentially, as a general rule in role-playing games, everything you have to count and keep track of detracts from the experience and is hard to remember. Like, I feel the only thing you should have to track as a player is like your money and your hit points. And even keeping track of how many arrows you have, it's hard to remember to like take off one arrow every time you fire an arrow in the game. And there are ways to get around this, because it's not really, I feel it's not really that important to keep track of exactly how many arrows you have, or exactly how many whatever. As, in a sense, everything in a role-playing game where you constantly forget to do something, you should think about sort of modding that rule, or try to cut that thing out, because when you forget to do something, that's not a good sign, is it? Like, I don't see that you could forget to keep track of hit points, for example, because that happens, the hit point loss happens in a dramatic situation where like you're not gonna forget to detract those hit points. But I have seen on many occasions players forgetting to like mark how many arrows they used, and it doesn't significantly detract from the experience of playing D&D, in my opinion. So yeah, make of this what you will, and if you have any thoughts about what I've said, or if you have any tips on how you have used mercenaries in your campaign, please tell me in the comments.